When you carry the cross, the flesh cries out, but the Spirit reigns. When Jesus spoke of the cross, he did not present it as a metaphor for comfort, success, or social approval. He presented it as a place of death. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. These words confront the modern believer with an uncomfortable truth. Following Christ was never meant to align with the desires of the flesh. It was meant to crucify them. The cross is not merely something Christ carried so that we could live freely in our flesh. It is the pattern he established for every soul that desires to walk in the Spirit. The moment a believer truly accepts the call of Christ, a war begins. The flesh resists. The old nature protests. The ego fights for survival. And yet within this conflict, something far greater is revealed. When the flesh cries out, the Spirit rises to reign. Many believers struggle not because they lack faith, but because they misunderstand the nature of spiritual authority. They expect peace without sacrifice, power without surrender, and transformation without death. But the kingdom of God does not operate on the terms of the flesh. It is birthed through obedience, sustained by surrender, and manifested through endurance. This message is not designed to comfort the flesh. It is meant to awaken the spirit. It speaks to those who feel the inner tension, the resistance, the heaviness that comes when God calls them higher. If you have felt misunderstood, pressed, or internally conflicted since drawing closer to God, it is not a sign of failure. It is evidence that the cross is doing its work. What follows is not theory. It is spiritual reality. The cross exposes the flesh, but it crowns the spirit. And only those willing to endure its weight will ever experience the authority that flows from it. The cross exposes the flesh before it empowers the spirit. The first work of the cross in a believer's life is exposure. Before the Spirit reigns, the flesh must be revealed for what it truly is. This is why carrying the cross feels uncomfortable, confrontational, and often painful. The cross shines light into areas the flesh has carefully hidden behind routine, religion, and self-justification. The flesh is not merely physical desire. It is the entire system of self-rule that resists dependence on God. It craves control, validation, comfort, recognition, and immediate gratification. It does not necessarily reject God outright. Instead, it seeks to coexist with him on its own terms. This is why the flesh can remain active even in religious environments. It can pray, serve, preach, and sing while still sitting on the throne of the heart. The cross does not negotiate with the flesh. It confronts it. When a believer begins to truly carry the cross, the flesh reacts violently. Old habits suddenly feel challenged. Compromises no longer bring peace. Desires that once felt harmless begin to feel heavy. This internal discomfort is not condemnation. It is conviction. The Spirit is exposing what the flesh has been using to maintain influence. Many believers mistakenly interpret this stage as spiritual failure. They say, "I feel more conflicted now than before," or "following God feels harder, not easier." But this is precisely the point where transformation begins. Before the cross, the flesh ruled unchallenged. After the cross, it is threatened. The flesh cries out because it is losing authority. This is why Jesus' path was marked by resistance at every level. The cross was not only a physical execution, it was the ultimate exposure of human pride, religious hypocrisy, political fear, and spiritual blindness. In the same way, when the cross enters your inner life, it exposes false motivations, hidden idols, and misplaced loyalties. The Spirit does not reign in areas that have not been surrendered, and surrender cannot occur without revelation. The flesh thrives in ambiguity. It survives where accountability is avoided and where obedience is delayed. But the cross removes ambiguity. It forces a decision. Will the believer continue to serve self while claiming Christ, or will they allow the Spirit to take full command? This is where many turn back, not because they do not love God, but because they are unwilling to let go of the identities the flesh has built. The flesh fears death more than it fears sin. It would rather remain spiritually active than spiritually crucified. But Scripture is unambiguous. Those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Crucifixion is not symbolic. It is decisive, it is slow, it is public, and it is final. As the cross exposes the flesh, something remarkable begins to happen. The believer becomes aware of just how much energy was being spent maintaining self-rule. Anxiety, insecurity, comparison, fear, and restlessness begin to make sense. These were not random struggles. They were symptoms of a throne occupied by the wrong authority. The Spirit does not force his reign. He waits for surrender. This is why the cross must be carried, not admired. Many admire the cross as a theological concept while avoiding its personal implications. They celebrate what Christ did for them without allowing his pattern to be formed in them. But spiritual authority does not come from admiration. It comes from alignment. As the flesh is exposed, the believer faces a critical choice: silence the conviction or submit to it. Silencing leads back to spiritual stagnation. Submission leads forward into spiritual authority. The flesh cries out loudly at this stage. It argues, it rationalizes, it reminds you of what you might lose. It magnifies discomfort and minimizes purpose. But beneath its noise lies fear. The flesh knows that once the Spirit reigns, it will never regain control. The Spirit's reign begins quietly, not with external power, but with internal clarity. As the believer chooses obedience over impulse, truth over comfort, and surrender over self-protection, a shift occurs. The inner chaos begins to settle. Discernment sharpens. Peace emerges, not because the struggle has ended, but because the authority has changed. The cross does not weaken the believer. It weakens the flesh so the Spirit can rule, and this is only the beginning. If this message is strengthening your spirit and helping you understand the deeper work God is doing within you, subscribe to the channel. This journey of truth, surrender, and spiritual authority continues, and you are not meant to walk it alone. When the flesh screams, it is because its throne is being taken. There is a moment in every genuine spiritual journey when silence inside the soul is broken by resistance. This resistance does not come from the world first, nor from people, nor from circumstances. It rises from within. It is the flesh reacting to the slow but irreversible loss of its authority. When the cross is carried consistently, the flesh begins to scream, not because it is strong, but because it is dying. The flesh only cries out when it is threatened. As long as it remains in control, it is quiet, subtle, and deceptive. It does not need to shout when it governs unchallenged. But the moment the Spirit begins to lead, the flesh panics. Its cries are not a sign that something is wrong spiritually. They are proof that something is finally changing. Most believers are unprepared for this phase because they were taught that spiritual growth always feels peaceful. In reality, peace is the result of order. And order only comes after authority is established. Before that, there is conflict. The flesh resists because it has built an entire identity around ruling the inner life. It does not merely want pleasure, it wants sovereignty. The flesh's scream takes many forms. It manifests as sudden emotional volatility, resurfacing temptations, exaggerated fatigue, irrational fear, or a deep sense of internal unrest. Things that once seemed manageable suddenly feel overwhelming. Old desires reappear with surprising intensity. The mind becomes louder, more argumentative, more defensive. This is not regression, it is exposure. When light enters a room that has been dark for years, everything hidden becomes visible at once. Dust rises, shapes appear unfamiliar. What was always there is now seen clearly. In the same way, when the Spirit's influence increases, the flesh reacts by making itself known. It would rather be confronted than ignored, because confrontation still allows it to fight. This is where many believers make a critical mistake. They assume that because the struggle has intensified, they must be moving away from God. They interpret resistance as rejection. But spiritual reality operates in the opposite direction. The closer the Spirit draws to the throne of the heart, the louder the flesh protests. Jesus experienced this reality in the Garden of Gethsemane. The flesh recoiled at the cost of obedience. "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." This was not sin. It was the natural response of human flesh facing complete surrender. What followed, however, was decisive. "Not my will, but yours be done." That moment did not eliminate suffering, but it established authority. From that point on, the Spirit reigned, even as the flesh endured pain. The believer's journey mirrors this pattern. The flesh screams most intensely right before it loses its grip. It exaggerates consequences. It whispers fear. It promises relief if you retreat. It reminds you of comfort, familiarity, and control. It frames obedience as loss rather than liberation. But the Spirit does not argue with the flesh. He does not negotiate. He waits for alignment. Authority in the spiritual realm is never seized. It is surrendered into. When the believer chooses obedience while the flesh is screaming, something profound occurs. The flesh learns that it is no longer the final authority. Each act of obedience weakens its influence. Each refusal to retreat strengthens the Spirit's reign. Over time, the screams lose intensity, not because the flesh has become holy, but because it has been dethroned. This is why spiritual maturity is marked by quiet strength rather than emotional volatility. Mature believers are not those who feel less temptation, but those whose identity is no longer governed by it. The flesh may speak, but it no longer commands. The reign of the Spirit does not remove the presence of the flesh, it removes its authority. The believer still lives in a body, still experiences desire, still faces temptation. But the center has shifted. Decisions are no longer driven by impulse, but by discernment. Reactions are no longer automatic, but intentional. Peace emerges, not because conflict is absent, but because leadership is clear. The flesh fears this clarity more than anything else. Confusion is its ally. Noise is its environment. When the Spirit reigns, the inner life becomes ordered. Priorities align. Convictions sharpen. The believer begins to sense when something is out of alignment, even if it once felt normal. This stage often brings loneliness, not because God has withdrawn, but because the flesh's old alliances begin to dissolve. Patterns, relationships, and environments that fed the flesh start to feel incompatible with the Spirit's leadership. This separation is not punishment, it is protection. The Spirit guards what He governs. Many believers attempt to quiet the flesh's screams by compromising rather than crucifying. They give it small concessions, hoping to maintain peace. But compromise only delays the inevitable. The flesh never settles for partial control. It always seeks the throne. True peace does not come from appeasing the flesh. It comes from establishing the Spirit's reign fully. As this reign becomes established, the believer begins to experience a different kind of strength. Not emotional highs, but spiritual steadiness. Not constant excitement, but deep assurance. Faith becomes less reactive and more rooted. Prayer becomes less desperate and more aligned. The believer no longer approaches God primarily to escape discomfort, but to remain obedient within it. This is the quiet authority of the Spirit. It does not announce itself loudly, it does not demand attention, but it reshapes everything from the inside out. The flesh screamed because it was losing power. The Spirit reigns because He was given permission. And once this transfer of authority is complete, the believer is never the same. The cross is no longer just something they carry. It becomes the place where true freedom was secured. If this teaching is helping you understand the inner battles you are facing and giving you clarity about the work God is doing within you, subscribe to the channel. These messages are here to strengthen your spirit, sharpen your discernment, and help you walk in the authority that comes from surrender. The Spirit reigns not by force, but by daily surrender. There is a dangerous misunderstanding that quietly weakens many believers. The idea that once the flesh is confronted, the battle is over. In truth, the reign of the Spirit is not established in a single dramatic moment, but through countless quiet decisions made day after day. The flesh does not lose its throne through force. It loses it through surrender, and surrender is not an event. It is a discipline. The Spirit does not conquer the inner life the way empires conquer territory. He does not invade violently, overthrow structures overnight, or silence resistance with displays of power. Instead, he reigns the way truth reigns, patiently, persistently, and unmistakably. He waits for the will of the believer to align with the will of God, again and again, until obedience becomes the default posture of the heart. This is where many believers grow weary. They expected the cross to end the struggle, not redefine it. They thought surrender would bring instant ease. But instead, they discovered consistency. The flesh hoped for a single crucifixion. The Spirit requires a daily one. Jesus did not say, "Take up your cross once." He said, "Take up your cross daily." This word daily dismantles every illusion of spiritual shortcuts. It means the flesh is not merely denied once, but continuously. It means yesterday's obedience does not excuse today's compromise. It means spiritual authority is maintained, not inherited. The flesh despises this reality because it thrives on extremes. It prefers emotional highs followed by neglect. It enjoys dramatic repentance, followed by gradual return to control. The Spirit, however, works in the ordinary, the repetitive, and the unseen. He reigns in the small choices no one applauds and the private obediences no one notices. This is why many believers appear spiritually strong in public, but remain internally unstable. Their surrender is situational, not structural. They submit when pressured, when emotional, or when desperate, but reclaim control when comfort returns. The Spirit does not reign fully in such a life because authority has not been consistently yielded. The flesh always looks for opportunities to reclaim the throne. It watches for fatigue, disappointment, unanswered prayers, and delayed results. In those moments, it whispers, "You've done enough," or "God understands," or "just this once." These whispers are not random temptations. They are strategic attempts to erode the pattern of surrender. The Spirit's reign is secured not by resisting temptation once, but by refusing to negotiate with it repeatedly. Each refusal strengthens spiritual alignment. Each compromise weakens it. This is not about perfection. It is about direction. A believer walking under the Spirit's reign may still stumble, but they no longer justify their fall. They return quickly, honestly, and humbly. The flesh, when ruling, defends itself. The Spirit, when reigning, corrects and restores. As surrender becomes daily, something subtle but profound changes in the believer's inner world. The noise begins to fade, not because the flesh has vanished, but because it has lost its authority to dictate behavior. Desires may still arise, but they no longer feel urgent. Thoughts may still wander, but they no longer feel commanding. Emotions may still fluctuate, but they no longer govern decisions. This is the difference between being tempted and being ruled. The Spirit reigns through alignment, not suppression. He does not demand that the believer stop feeling. He teaches them to stop obeying what they feel. This distinction is critical. Many believers attempt to silence emotions rather than submit them. In doing so, they create internal pressure instead of internal order. When emotions are submitted to the Spirit, they find their proper place. Fear becomes discernment, desire becomes passion for righteousness, anger becomes clarity against injustice. The flesh distorts these forces, the Spirit redirects them. Daily surrender also reshapes the believer's relationship with time. The flesh is impatient. It demands immediate results, visible progress, and quick relief. The Spirit is eternal. He values depth over speed, formation over appearance. Under his reign, the believer learns to trust process instead of outcomes. This patience frustrates the flesh. It wants proof. It wants affirmation. It wants evidence that surrender is working, but the Spirit often works below the surface long before anything becomes visible. Roots grow before fruit appears. Authority is established internally before it manifests externally. This is why many abandon surrender prematurely. They mistake silence for absence and delay for denial. They do not realize that the Spirit is dismantling structures that were built over years. He is reordering the inner life so that when fruit appears, it will last. As the Spirit reigns more fully, the believer begins to notice a shift in how they respond to pressure. Where they once reacted impulsively, they now pause. Where they once defended themselves, they now listen. Where they once sought control, they now seek clarity. This is not weakness, it is authority. True spiritual authority does not need to assert itself loudly. It carries weight because it is aligned with truth. When the Spirit reigns, the believer's words carry substance, their presence carries peace, and their decisions carry integrity. This authority is not learned through instruction alone. It is formed through surrender. The flesh cannot imitate this authority. It can perform, imitate, and manipulate, but it cannot sustain consistency. It burns out. It overreacts. It collapses under pressure. The Spirit, however, produces steadiness. He teaches the believer how to remain anchored even when circumstances fluctuate. Daily surrender also clarifies calling. Under the flesh's rule, calling is often confused with ambition. The believer seeks significance, influence, and validation. Under the Spirit's reign, calling becomes obedience. The believer focuses less on where they are going and more on how they are walking. This shift brings freedom. The pressure to prove oneself dissolves. Comparison loses its grip. The believer no longer needs to be seen to feel secure. Their confidence comes from alignment, not applause. The flesh hates this freedom because it cannot control it. Control is its currency. The Spirit reigns through trust. Over time, surrender reshapes the believer's identity. They no longer see themselves primarily as someone fighting sin, but as someone belonging to God. This identity shift is crucial. When identity is rooted in belonging, obedience flows naturally. When identity is rooted in struggle, exhaustion follows. The Spirit reigns best where identity is secure. This does not mean the journey becomes easy. It means it becomes clear. The believer understands why resistance comes and where strength is found. They stop being surprised by temptation and start being prepared for it. They stop fearing discomfort and start recognizing it as part of formation. Daily surrender transforms the cross from a symbol of suffering into a source of stability. The cross becomes the place where the believer returns again and again to realign their will with God's. It is no longer just something carried in crisis. It becomes the center of daily life. And in this consistency, the flesh finally understands something it feared all along. It is no longer in charge. The Spirit reigns, not because the flesh disappeared, but because the believer stopped giving it permission. If this message is helping you understand why consistency matters more than intensity, and why daily surrender is the foundation of spiritual authority, subscribe to the channel. These teachings exist to strengthen your walk, clarify your calling, and help you remain faithful in the unseen places where true transformation happens. The authority of the Spirit is forged in suffering, not in comfort. There is a truth few are willing to confront. Comfort has never produced spiritual authority. Comfort preserves what already exists, but it does not transform. Authority, the kind that reshapes the inner life and stabilizes the soul, is forged in suffering. Not suffering for its own sake, but suffering that emerges from obedience. This is why carrying the cross inevitably leads through places the flesh despises and the Spirit uses. The flesh equates blessing with ease. It assumes that if God is pleased, resistance will decrease, pain will lessen, and life will become smoother. When the opposite occurs, the flesh quickly concludes that something is wrong. But the Spirit understands something the flesh cannot grasp. Pressure is not punishment, it is preparation. Every dimension of spiritual authority visible in Scripture was formed through sustained pressure. Abraham learned trust not through abundance, but through waiting. Moses learned leadership not in Pharaoh's palace, but in the wilderness. David learned kingship not on the throne, but in exile. Jesus revealed ultimate authority not through escape, but through endurance. The pattern is unmistakable. Authority is not bestowed before suffering, it is revealed through it. When the believer carries the cross, suffering becomes unavoidable. This suffering does not always look dramatic. Often it is quiet, internal, and misunderstood. It manifests as delayed answers, misunderstood obedience, unfulfilled expectations, and the persistent discomfort of not being able to return to former ways of living. The flesh interprets this as loss. The Spirit recognizes it as refinement. The flesh hates suffering because suffering strips away illusion. It removes the false sense of control the flesh depends on. It exposes how much security was placed in circumstances rather than in God. In suffering, the believer learns what truly governs their peace. This is why suffering intensifies when the Spirit begins to reign more fully, not because God is cruel, but because the remaining influence of the flesh must be confronted where it hides most effectively, in the desire for relief. Relief is not the same as peace. Relief ends discomfort temporarily. Peace stabilizes the soul permanently. The flesh chases relief. The Spirit produces peace. When obedience leads to suffering, the believer is faced with a defining choice. They can seek immediate relief by compromising, or they can endure discomfort while remaining aligned. This choice determines who reigns. Many believers unknowingly surrender authority back to the flesh at this stage. They obey until obedience becomes costly. They carry the cross until it becomes heavy. They follow Christ until the path becomes narrow, not because they reject God, but because they fear prolonged discomfort. But authority is not forged in moments of enthusiasm. It is forged in moments of endurance. Suffering exposes motivation. It reveals whether obedience is transactional or relational. If obedience is rooted in expected outcomes, suffering will feel unbearable. If obedience is rooted in trust, suffering becomes meaningful. The Spirit uses suffering to deepen alignment. When external supports are removed, the believer is forced inward. Prayer becomes less performative and more honest. Faith becomes less theoretical and more necessary. Dependence shifts from habit to survival. In this environment, the Spirit's voice becomes clearer. Not louder, but more distinct. Distractions lose their appeal. Superficial desires weaken. The believer begins to sense what truly matters and what was merely noise. The flesh resists this clarity fiercely. It tries to reframe suffering as abandonment. It whispers that obedience should not feel this hard. It suggests that compromise would be reasonable, understandable, even wise. But compromise never leads to authority. It leads to fragmentation. The Spirit does not remove suffering immediately because suffering is doing essential work. It is breaking the flesh's grip on comfort as a source of identity. As long as comfort defines well-being, the flesh retains leverage. When comfort loses its authority, the spirit reigns more freely. This does not mean suffering becomes enjoyable. It means it becomes purposeful. The believer who endures suffering without surrendering obedience undergoes a quiet transformation. Their faith becomes anchored, their emotions become less volatile, their reactions become measured. They are no longer easily shaken by external changes because their center has shifted. This is spiritual authority in its purest form, not dominance over others, but mastery over self, not loud declarations, but steady presence, not control of circumstances, but alignment within them. Suffering also teaches discernment. The believer learns the difference between what feels urgent and what is truly important. The flesh thrives on urgency. It pushes for immediate action, quick decisions, emotional reactions. The Spirit teaches patience. He slows the inner life so decisions flow from clarity rather than pressure. Through suffering, the believer learns to wait without losing faith, to endure without becoming bitter, to obey without visible affirmation. These capacities cannot be learned in comfort. They are forged only where obedience costs something. This is why many who seek spiritual authority never find it. They pursue gifts without formation, power without process, and influence without endurance. But authority that is not forged in suffering collapses under pressure. Only authority formed through endurance remains stable. As the Spirit reigns through suffering, the believer begins to experience a deeper kind of freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from fear of difficulty. The cross no longer represents only pain. It becomes a place of security. The believer knows that as long as they remain obedient, no suffering is wasted. This confidence changes everything. The believer no longer panics when comfort disappears. They no longer measure God's faithfulness by ease. They trust that the Spirit is working even when circumstances are silent. The flesh loses power here because it can no longer use discomfort as leverage. Its greatest weapon has been neutralized. Suffering becomes the soil in which authority grows. The Spirit reigns most clearly in believers who have suffered well, not those who avoided pain, but those who endured it without abandoning truth. Their faith carries weight. Their words carry depth. Their presence carries peace. They do not need to announce their authority. It is evident. If this teaching is helping you understand why obedience often leads through difficulty and why suffering is not a sign of failure but of formation, subscribe to the channel. These messages are here to help you endure wisely, remain aligned, and walk in the authority that only the Spirit can establish. When the cross becomes your identity, the Spirit rules without resistance. There comes a stage in the believer's journey where the cross is no longer experienced merely as a burden to be carried, but as an identity to be lived. This is the point where the Spirit's reign moves from being contested to being established. The flesh does not vanish, but it no longer fights for the throne, because the throne is no longer negotiable. Authority has been settled. Direction has been fixed. The believer knows who governs their inner life. This stage is not reached quickly, and it is never accidental. It is the result of repeated surrender, endured suffering, and consistent obedience. By the time the cross becomes identity rather than obligation, something irreversible has occurred within the soul. The believer no longer asks, "How much must I give up?" They ask, "How closely can I remain aligned?" The flesh loses power when it realizes that obedience is no longer conditional. Early in the journey, the flesh negotiates. It obeys when obedience feels rewarding. It yields when resistance feels dangerous. But when the cross becomes identity, obedience is no longer tied to outcomes. It is tied to belonging. At this point, the believer does not obey to become something. They obey because they already are something. They belong to God. This shift changes everything. The believer no longer experiences the Christian life as a cycle of victory and failure, but as a steady walk of alignment. Temptation still appears, but it feels foreign rather than familiar. Old patterns still try to resurface, but they no longer feel like home. The flesh speaks, but its voice lacks authority. It is heard, but not obeyed. This is not emotional numbness, it is spiritual clarity. When the cross becomes identity, the believer's sense of self is no longer rooted in desire, success, recognition, or comfort. It is rooted in obedience. And obedience, when it becomes identity, produces stability. The believer is no longer tossed between spiritual enthusiasm and exhaustion. Their faith is no longer driven by mood. It is anchored in truth. The Spirit reigns freely here because resistance has lost its foundation. Resistance requires attachment. The flesh can only fight for what the believer is unwilling to release. Once identity is fully surrendered, there is nothing left to defend. This is why mature believers often appear quiet. Not withdrawn, but settled. Not passive, but discerning. Their energy is not spent fighting internal battles that were resolved long ago. Their strength is preserved because it is no longer divided. Division is the flesh's greatest weapon. As long as the believer is internally divided, the flesh retains influence. But when the cross unifies the inner life, division dissolves. The believer's thoughts, desires, and decisions begin to move in the same direction. This unity produces authority. Spiritual authority is not loud. It does not need to prove itself. It is recognized because it flows from alignment. People sense it not through dominance, but through presence. There is weight in the believer's words, not because of eloquence, but because of integrity. There is peace in their presence, not because life is easy, but because their center is anchored. The believer who has embraced the cross's identity no longer seeks validation. Approval has lost its power. Criticism has lost its sting. Praise no longer inflates. Rejection no longer destabilizes. The flesh once depended on these external forces to define worth. The Spirit has replaced them with truth. This freedom is not emotional detachment, it is emotional maturity. The believer still feels deeply, but feelings no longer govern decisions. Compassion grows without compromising conviction. Love deepens without eroding boundaries. Strength emerges without hardness. The Spirit reigns most clearly in this balance. At this stage, suffering no longer surprises the believer. They expect difficulty without fearing it. They understand that obedience does not exempt them from pain, but it redeems pain's purpose. When hardship comes, they do not immediately ask why. They ask how to remain aligned within it. This posture marks spiritual maturity. The cross has reshaped their understanding of life. Success is no longer measured by ease or achievement, but by faithfulness. Progress is no longer measured by visibility, but by depth. Growth is no longer measured by how much they know, but by how consistently they obey. The flesh finds no leverage here. It cannot tempt with shortcuts because the believer values formation more than speed. It cannot threaten with loss because the believer has already surrendered everything. It cannot intimidate with discomfort because endurance has been learned. This does not mean the believer becomes invulnerable. It means they become anchored. Storms still come, but they no longer redefine identity. Pressure still builds, but it no longer fractures faith. The Spirit reigns fully when the believer no longer needs to be convinced to obey. Obedience has become the natural response. This is the quiet triumph of the cross. At this point, the believer's life itself becomes a testimony, not because it is flawless, but because it is coherent. There is consistency between belief and behavior, conviction and conduct. Hypocrisy loses ground because alignment has taken its place. Others may not understand the believer's choices. They may question their restraint, their patience, their refusal to compromise. But the believer no longer needs to explain. Their peace speaks for them. The cross has done its work. When the flesh cried out, it was because its reign was ending. When the Spirit reigns, it is because surrender was completed. The believer now walks not as someone constantly struggling to follow Christ, but as someone shaped by Him. This is the destination of the journey, not perfection, but alignment, not comfort, but authority, not self-rule, but Spirit-led life. And from this place, the believer becomes a quiet force in the world, not driven by reaction, but guided by truth, not shaped by culture, but anchored in conviction, not ruled by the flesh, but governed by the Spirit. This is what it means to carry the cross until it becomes identity. If this message has strengthened your spirit, clarified your journey, and helped you understand the deeper work God is doing within you, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are here to walk with you through surrender, endurance, and transformation so that the Spirit may reign fully in your life.